Grüezi Amerika, Views from the Sister Republic, a University of St. Gallen podcast by Claudia Brüwiler. Grüezi miteinander, and welcome to another episode of Views from the Sister Republic. Many tried to predict what Donald J. Trump's first 100 days in office would amount to. The best advice, I think, stemmed from Karl Rove, longtime Republican strategist and political legend, who said, "Buckle up, buttercup. It's going to be a wild ride." And yes, a wild ride it has been, particularly since Liberation Day, which brought tariffs for America's friends and foes alike, even uninhabited islands. While some have dismissed Trump's economic agenda as sheer madness, others claim to detect method to the madness and believe it all part of a larger plan to plunge the US into recession and restructure its debt. But is there any truth to these claims? And what to make of the economic roller coaster we have been dragged onto by Donald J. Trump? Thankfully, I have someone to give us a survey class in Rollercoaster Economics 101, and that is Simon J. Evenett from IMD Lausanne. Welcome to the podcast, Simon.
Thank you, Claudia. It's great to be here.
I think generations of HSG students and MBA and MBA students know Simon very well because you have been with us for nearly 2 decades, I think, before you left for greener shores on the Lac Léman. You were for us the man of international trade, and you are the founder of the St. Gallen Endowment for Prosperity Through Trade, which has one of its most, I think, impactful projects, the Global Trade Alert, which for everyone leaves data and explanatory briefings on what is going on in the world of international trade. Among other things, you're also co-chair of the World Economics Forum's Global Future Council on Trade and Investment, and you have been for ages been an advisor on global trade, for instance, with the World Bank. You've been frequently quoted in international media. So, in other words, you're the man to talk to on international trade. You studied at Cambridge and then you did your PhD at Yale. So you're an Ivy League creature to an extent, and probably also following what is going on with US universities. Was Yale your first American experience, or had you been to the US before becoming a PhD student?
Yale was my first major US experience. I think I had flown through North America on the way to New Zealand as a child, but I don't think that counts.
And what was your, in the beginning years of your American exposure, what was one of your favorite memories that was to this day something you remember as typically American?
Well, there is this famous quote from Churchill that US and UK are 2 countries divided by a common language. And on my second day in the United States, I went shopping to buy all sorts of essentials for my new apartment in New Haven in Connecticut. And so I walked into a store, bought a number of products, went up to pay for it, and handed over the money. And the person at the till turned around and said, "You're all set," after I had paid. And I looked at them thinking, what does that mean? All set for what? Do I need to have permission to leave? Anyway, that led to an awkward 1 or 2 seconds until I realized that obviously this was a saying which was the conclusion and that maybe I should leave. So anyway, that's when I learned my first of many Americanisms. And I must say, I think the Americans have got some amazing turns of phrase, which I quite like. Okay, so, another one for anyone who's having relationship trouble, one of my graduate school friends used to say, "Oh, there's trouble in paradise." So phrases like this, I just think are brilliant. And the US has its own, in many ways, respects, distinctive sense of humor from the UK.
Trouble in paradise. I didn't know that Brits don't say that.
No, that's not a British expression at all. But it was fabulous. There are all sorts of fabulous sayings in the US, and of course their comedy shows are amazing. Saturday Night Live and the other skits just extraordinarily funny. So it's a country with its own sort of humor ecosystem. By the way, many of the countries which have linked strong ties to the US, to the UK, have their own forms of humor. I mean, Australian humor is extremely distinctive as well. So, much to look back on with fondness with my time in the United States, which lasted 11 years, by the way.
Oh, 11 years. Wow. But that was both graduate studies and then working for the World Bank, I guess.
So that was graduate studies, working at the University of Michigan, Rutgers University, and the World Bank. And for much of the last 7 or 8 years, I was, or maybe 6 or 7 years, was also a fellow of the Brookings Institution. So it was very much East Coast, Midwest focused. I didn't actually get out to the West Coast until much later in my career.
I would like to pick you up on the saying that you just quoted, trouble in paradise, because that seems to be the mood right now. Although I would not say that world trade has ever been anything Eden-esque, but there seems to be a bit of shall we say, nostalgia for old school globalization, even by those who at one time considered it the evil incarnate, who seem suddenly to be very fond of the idea of laissez-faire capitalism. Many say that Trump is good at identifying and naming problems, and that has actually won him elections, but that they do not necessarily think his answers are good. But would you say that his description, his analysis of the state of America's economy is actually accurate? Has he been good at identifying the problems of America's economy?
So I would argue that he has been effective at identifying certain problems and ones which he feels he can capitalize on politically. I do not think his diagnosis is at all comprehensive. I don't think it in many ways adds up to a sort of coherent alternative economic understanding of what ails the United States, and by the way, and what does well in the United States, because one should recognize there are enormous strengths in the United States economy. With respect to what the president has done, I think, contrary to many of his critics, he is a very perceptive individual. He listens very carefully when he wants to, and he also sees things as well, and he picks up and intuits things. And I think he's capable of talking to a wide range of people in a way that perhaps some of his opponents, like Kamala Harris, would have found very difficult to do. Now, in the case of the diagnosis, I think he saw that in the key swing states that U.S. manufacturing had been in serious trouble for some time, and that the number of jobs had declined over time. In fact, the number of jobs in manufacturing in the U.S. has been rising for pretty much a decade, but still in many of the swing states, the numbers are still quite depressed. And of course, the geographic concentration of those job losses and the knock-on effects for all the service industries which relied on all those factories has led a number of towns and geographies to be extremely adversely affected. And I think the president was very perceptive at identifying this. He's not the only US politician which has identified this. I remember being in Washington in the early 1990s and hearing Democrats, representatives from Michigan, making very similar arguments in terms of appealing to communities which were in trouble. And so the president, I think, has picked up on these aspects and has tried, and I would argue successfully, appealed to people in those swing states and argued that he has a solution. Now, and that your question was, has he diagnosed things right? I think he has diagnosed a number of problems correctly. One was the geographically concentrated one, which I discussed, and the other one, which was unmissable, unless, of course, you were a Democrat, was the high levels of inflation, which were ravaging the U.S. economy in the run-up to the election. And I think we're not talking about Zimbabwean or Argentinian levels of inflation, but by historical standards of the previous 25 years, these were elevated rates of inflation. And there are a lot of people living on fixed nominal incomes found themselves squeezed. And there were very salient examples. Of course, the price of eggs is the one that people talk about now, where it was possible for the president to point to deficiencies and price increases, which were eating away at living standards. So in that sense, President Trump is, I believe, highly perceptive. I think the thing which convinced me about that, beyond hearing his numerous speeches, was the podcast he did with Joe Rogan, where he showed a remarkable willingness to listen and to engage. And that showed a side of his personality that, once I heard it, shifted my calculations as to who would win the presidential election quite significantly in his favor. And so in that sense, I think he's underestimated. His style often, when it's clear that he doesn't want to listen, he makes that very, very clear. But I'm not sure that that's 100% of his modus operandi at all. And as I said, I think he's able to identify problems. He selects which ones he is willing to engage on. He is able to cultivate grievance around this, and this is where it translates then into a political strategy. Where, of course, it would be great if there were solutions which were able to address all of these problems. And there, I think that is the weakness, and we may come to that in further discussion.
Yeah, I just would like to go back to what you said before you started at outlining the problems that he has identified, because you said he does not have a comprehensive view, though, of the economy, and that he is also, don't remember correctly how you phrased it, but that he's essentially turning a blind eye also on the strengths of America's economy. So what has he been leaving out in his problem assessment?
I think there's two key things the president has omitted. The first is to recognize the central importance that technology has played in reducing the demand for labor in U.S. manufacturing. And this, I think, is a critical factor which has been at work. And I think it would be fair to say that many analysts of the U.S. manufacturing industry would highlight the role of technology as well as trade in terms of reducing employment. And so that's a problem. And the deeper problem there is that if people lose their jobs in manufacturing, do they have the capabilities to be able to redeploy into other sectors where they can earn a comparable salary? And here I think there's real question marks. And then that begs the question whether what's missing to the diagnosis is the quality of schooling, the quality of vocational training. These are, of course, things that Switzerland does quite differently from the United States. And so that's an area, I think, of weakness. And of course, in his diagnosis, I think he has actually he's kept the human in as far as the voter is concerned. He hasn't thought about the human in terms of the capabilities to be able to succeed. And this will, I think, be a big problem as firms try and expand in US manufacturing, because they will find that there are very significant labor shortages in the specific skills and competencies which are required. So that's the sort of misdiagnosis as far as manufacturing is concerned. The area that he's overlooked, the blind spot in terms of American success, relates to the parts of the US service sector which are extremely high value added and which compete very well on foreign markets, on global markets. And this side of the US economy, which adds significantly to the trade surplus, or at least let me turn that around. The trade surplus in services significantly diminishes the overall trade deficit, where there's a large trade deficit in goods. That feature he has chosen to overlook. And I think that's surprising, and in some sense, well, no, it's not surprising. It's just a major oversight. Many politicians and analysts over the years have struggled to understand the service sector as an important source of value creation. And I think this is a tragedy, because in most of our societies, the service sector is by far the largest. And so that's an area which I think is a major blind spot in the president's analysis of the US economy.
In Switzerland, we also found it tragic that he was overlooking the service sector, particularly with regards to trade, because the United States has a surplus in the trades and services with Switzerland, but he was only looking at trades and goods. And therefore, we ended up with these interesting tariff calculations. You followed Liberation Day, as he called it, very closely. You and Johannes Fritz of the Global Trade Alert published a lot of data to showcase the actual tariff hike that we had to ended up with on Liberation Day. Were you surprised by how these tariffs were calculated?
In short, yes, I was surprised. I was surprised as to, quite frankly, how crude the formula was. I was not surprised that the calculation was misguided, and I'll explain why. For 40 years, academic trade economists have tried to come up with an empirical way to sum up all of the different trade barriers and trade affecting government measures that a country has in what are called measures of openness. If I think back to the first paper I read on this, it was written in 1988. So you can see it's almost a 40-year project. And what the project has tried to do is to try and find a way which is how to measure openness of economies, taking account of all the factors that drive openness, some of which have nothing to do with policy, and try and empirically implement them. This project has not been a success, because it's a very, very complicated problem. It's not only theoretically difficult to model, it's also very hard to find all of the data you need. And even though myself, Johannes, and the Global Trade Alert team have spent 15 years building a very, very large data set of policy interventions, there are still pieces which we have not covered as well in the work that we've done at the St. Gallen Endowment. And so there are gaps both in terms of theory and in terms of data. So when I heard in February the president was instructing his team to come up with a way to calculate how closed foreign economies were to US exports, and therefore to what tariff might be needed to remedy this, I was surprised that he'd given essentially his team 8 weeks, less than 8 weeks, to come up with an answer that researchers hadn't answered in 40 years. And so when on Liberation Day, or the day 2nd of April, President Trump announced, or rather his team announces, a formula which relates the tariff that a country has to pay to the size of its trade surplus with the United States divided by the exports it has to the United States, and then that sum divided by 2, that formula is a shortcut. It does not take account of the policies of the other countries. So the tariff which is applied to Switzerland, which is 31 or 32%, depending on which document you look at.
I think it's 32 in the executive order.
Yeah, and 31 on the day of the announcement. So it changed overnight.
Well,
and,
Taiwan is a country there too, so I don't think we can take the announcement as in verbatim.
Yeah, no, it was, so it's either 31 or 32. Formally, it's 32. There is no clear relationship between that number and the policies that Switzerland has, which, of course, if you're sitting in Bern, creates a problem, because you'd love to know which policy levers you'd have to pull to get that tariff rate down, but that's not clear. And that creates then essentially a black box where it's unclear what the relationship is between the type of measures that Switzerland takes and that the tariff treatment which Swiss exporters will face. So that's one big problem with the formula. I guess the other problem with the formula is that they applied it to 1 year's worth of data. And here Switzerland got very unlucky, because in the past 2 years, there's been a surge of gold exports to the United States, which has pushed up Swiss exports and pushed up the bilateral trade deficit. And essentially, those gold exports have probably nothing to do with Swiss treatment of American products or policy treatment. So it's a completely independent exogenous factor, and this has pushed up the trade surplus and then pushed up the tariff. And what I've done in separate calculations is to go back over time to see what countries' tariffs would have been if you had used this formula year by year. And for many countries, they fluctuate a lot. So the application of this formula introduces a whole series of volatility or uncertainties which exporters would face. Now, to be frank, I don't think this formula will survive. It has been so heavily criticized. My academic colleagues have rightly highlighted the lack of microeconomic foundations to this formula as well, and that's a very legitimate point to make. And I think the level of criticism at this formula has been quite extraordinary, and I think as a result it will be withdrawn. But essentially it's being used to put down a marker to say to Switzerland, give us something or you pay 32%. And that is where we're at. And of course, the process going forward will be one of trying to find a way through this so that Swiss exporters are not so adversely affected.
You already used the expression of a black box, and that leads me to the next question, which also determines as to what countries can offer the United States to get rid of these high tariffs. And that is the question of what is actually the end game here? What is Donald Trump's objective with these tariffs? Some are arguing reindustrialization, but you have already pointed out for all the reasons that there is no going back to the 1950s and the kind of industry that kept the Midwest not rusty, but really well and prosperous. So what, in your reading, is Donald Trump's endgame here?
To be honest, I don't think he knows what his endgame is. And he sees that as a feature, not a bug. The rest of us see it as a bug, or at least many of us see it as a bug. He sees this as a feature. I think Donald Trump has applied a negotiating mindset, which he has cultivated during his years in New York real estate, where extreme uncertainty, power plays, pressure plays are all part of the game, and it is for him a game. And what he wants to do essentially is to obtain what he thinks is the best possible deal. Now, that deal could involve lots of different things, whether that involves changes in Swiss policy, Swiss commitments to buy certain amounts of American products, or whether it involves outcomes in the United States, such as levels of investment in the US by Swiss firms, or ultimately manufacturing revival. It's unclear which of any of those things he actually wants. There has been a mini industry of people trying to figure out what does Donald Trump want, and some of us have come to the conclusion that the ambiguity that he has constructed is deliberate, and it represents his view that his leverage, as he sees it in these negotiations, is maximized if he does not specify what the end game is. And I think this has led, if that is correct, then if that's the correct diagnosis, then it will be incredibly frustrating for the negotiators of every country going to the United States, because essentially they will be going there, and it will not be a negotiation. It'll be a sort of tell us what you're going to give us, and if we're satisfied, we might reduce your tariffs. And so, in that sense, it's more of a supplication than a negotiation. The president has also made it very clear that the theater of having lots of heads of government come to visit him in the White House is something he finds attractive. I mean, You heard his statements at a recent Republican fundraiser where he said that many people were coming, many heads of state were going to come, and they were going to come to, quote, in his words, kiss my ass, suggests that there is a premium being put on the process, not just the outcomes. Now, all of this is highly unusual diplomatic process and substance, or if there is any substance. And I think it leads us then to to wonder really what is going on. So I tend to be in the school which says that it's not worth trying to what they call sane wash Donald Trump. That is trying to find some sanity to this madness. I think it's a mistake to think there is one. I think what we have is an incredibly determined political leader who has surrounded himself with people who are willing to acquiesce to his demands, and where he is at the center of decision making, where he will ultimately decide whether a deal gets done with a foreign country, and that there will be a certain amount of drama along the way. And there will be a certain amount of theatrics, and this is, I think, the critical thing. This is so different from a classic economic negotiation that one would have between governments. And I think in that sense, we can expect a drawn-out process with quite a lot of fireworks from time to time as these negotiations go forward. And quite frankly, there's just not enough time to be able to process all of these different overtures which governments have made to the United States, including Switzerland. And so someone has to be later in that queue, or some countries have to be later in that queue. And if they're later, then the question is, does patience run out in Washington, and they get those trading partners get hit with tariffs anyway? So in that sense, the process is highly uncertain going forward, but that's exactly how the president wants it.
I think it's very telling that even an economist goes to the metaphors of theater and court behavior when you're explaining what is going on. I think we all need to study a bit more the performative side of politics to better grasp what is happening at the White House. However, I would like to go back to a theory that has come out of what you called so nicely the mini industry of people who try to figure out what the president's endgame is, if there is one, because that has gotten a lot of traction, particularly in social media, namely that the idea that Trump would want to purposely cause a recession in the United States to tackle its debt. Do you see any merit to this idea?
No. Short answer is no. I think if a recession happens, the president will, of course, try and capitalize it in some way, possibly even deflect the blame for it onto others. He will not accept the responsibility for it. But one thing is, for sure, I do not believe that he entered the White House thinking he would do anything other than cause a boom of the U.S. economy. I mean, he has such conviction in his own capabilities that I think he felt that the U.S. was going to accelerate its growth due to tax cuts and deregulation. I do not think he anticipated anything like the reaction that we have seen from both consumers whose sentiment is deteriorating, firms who are putting capex on hold, and the financial markets, which are clearly in a state of shock and disbelief. I don't think he anticipated any of that. And I think if anyone had tried to tell him that this was going to happen, he would have dismissed it. So I don't think there is a plan to engineer a recession so as to be able to accomplish any goal. I don't think that was his intention at all. And I think, again, it comes down to the mistake of trying to overinterpret what Donald Trump is doing, trying to discern a method to what would, if it were English, we would say a method to the madness.
Yeah.
But I think perhaps we would be able to say more polite, a method to the arbitrary selection of policies which we seem to experience day by day from this particular White House.
You said that for some countries, it will be more supplication than negotiation. But at the moment, we'd like to negotiate. And Switzerland has jumped the queue a bit with Karin Keller-Sutter making an early call to the White House. If you were in the role of, and maybe you will be in the role of, or you already are in the role of someone who is advising the Swiss government, you probably couldn't tell us if you were. What do you think should Switzerland offer, even though we do not know what the end game is? But as Donald Trump doesn't know what the end game is either, what do you think would be the most attractive offer Switzerland could place?
So let me be absolutely clear. I am not advising the Swiss government at all. And they have plenty of capable diplomats who can take this particular task forward. Now, as to or the position of Switzerland or indeed any country in this case, I think the first thing one would want to do would be to try and understand what is it that the American officials who you have to deal with first round actually say the president wants, or what do they think he wants. Unfortunately, as we're learning from the Canadians and the Europeans, European Union officials, that is, the U.S. administration hasn't really specified what it wants in any type of detail, which then makes it very difficult for a country like Switzerland to prepare its negotiating position. What the Swiss could do is take a look at the National Trade Estimates report, which is published by the U.S. Trade Representative's Office, which has a chapter on every trading partner that the United States has concerns with, and see what matters are raised there as being of concern to the United States, and then seeing if there are any of those matters which Switzerland's prepared to reform, or at least talk about reforming if tariffs come down, and maybe structure the assessment around that. I think that particular challenge Switzerland faces is that although at the moment pharmaceuticals are not being subject to tariffs, they will be, I think, within 1 to 2 months. And this will happen, and this is non-negotiable for the United States because it will fall under a national security exception. And that's an area then where essentially the US is trying to encourage firms to migrate as much of their activity away from Switzerland and from other countries to the United States. And so in that sense, this is all pure loss. And so rather than end on a sort of a negative note, maybe the right response, or part of the right response for Switzerland, is to ask itself whether its level of exposure to the US economy as far as trading goods is concerned is at a level which is too high, and that export diversification is a strategy which should be pursued. Now, the Swiss government has for many years tried to sign free trade agreements with many other countries with that goal in mind. And I think one thing one might do if for officials in Bern would be to look at every tool available for export diversification, to see if they can be made more effective, or their scope enhanced, or the take-up by Swiss companies enhanced. So I think that would be the dimension to work on. More generally, I would urge governments of all types actually to think about the degree of exposure to all of the big players in the world economy. And so, if in the case of Switzerland, are they too exposed to the EU? Are they too exposed to China? Are they too exposed to the US? There are over 200 trading economies in the world. Not all of them are the same size, clearly. But the question then is whether or not the portfolio of export revenues can be diversified in a way that reduces the risks associated with exporting to any one jurisdiction. And that approach, not just trying to maximize exports, but thinking about the allocation of exports across export destinations and diversification, is probably something that's worth doing. Of course, the capacity, that's just one aspect. Another thing, and here Switzerland typically does quite well, is to think about all the measures necessary to improve the competitiveness and the supply side resilience of the Swiss economy, to find ways in which firms can essentially adapt and pivot more effectively when shocks and disruption happens. And this is an area where classic supply side reform is an area where all countries, including Switzerland, could do a little bit more. So I think there's a package there. I'm not sure that the negotiations with Washington are central to that package. They will have to be pursued, because failure to pursue them will not go down well with the occupant in the White House. He doesn't like to be ignored, but it should be only one of many different policies changes that Switzerland might consider?
Switzerland is one player that is caught up in all of this. And of course, we at HSG care particularly about the prospects of the Swiss economy. But of course, the biggest, I would even say, standoff is between the US and China. And China has been retaliating with tariffs on its side. There has been a lot of back and forth whether China is more vulnerable in this skirmish, in this conflict, than the United States, whether the United States does indeed have escalation dominance in this scenario. How do you assess the particular situation between China and the US?
I assess it in the following way. My view is that no one wins trade wars, and no country engaged in a bilateral trade war will win. It's more a matter of how much harm you're prepared to accept in order to harm the other party. Here, there has been one of the features of President Trump's approach is to think that tariff rates are the indicator of toughness. Now, anyone who's taken an economics course, in particular an international trade class, will know that at some point a tariff becomes so high that it shuts out all imports. So if you raise tariffs above that level, it doesn't make any difference. Okay, and so you could have if the tariff that shuts out imports is, say, 80%, and you raise tariffs to 120%, that's no tougher than the 80% tariff. If you double the 120% tariff to 240, it's still no tougher than the 80% tariff. So this shows you that there's limits to quote how much you can use this headline grabbing policy instrument. And so what we have is essentially a tool which the president has been ramping up, and his assumption is that because China exports more to the United States than the US exports to China, that the US has the upper hand. That's the wrong way to think about leverage. Leverage should be thought of in multiple ways. China has a number of commodities which the US needs exporting to it. And so by cutting off the export of those commodities, such as rare earths, China can hit the United States. And that has nothing to do with the trade surplus that China has with the United States. Furthermore, the US has service companies which sell into China or are operating within China, and the US has production facilities in China too, or at least American firms have those. They are also potential targets for retaliation of lots of different types. And again, I'm not endorsing any of those retaliation options. So the Americans are a lot more vulnerable than just the trade in goods angle, where they have this limited tool called a tariff to whack the Chinese. So I think there is a gross misunderstanding of the vulnerabilities of the United States. And there's a second enormous flaw in the thinking on the US part. That is that, of course, China can redirect its exports to third markets and to expand its exports to third markets. One of the calculations I did was the following, was to calculate what is the rate of growth of China's exports to third markets over time, and how many years would it take for China to replace all of its exports to the United States if it lost all of those exports. And that calculation suggests less than 3 years.
Oh, wow.
So China is in that sense, so long as the rest of the world's markets stay open, and that is an if, and we can unpack that a little bit if you want. So long as the rest of the world's markets stay open, then China is able to adjust to the loss of all US exports. It will not lose all of its US exports. So the 3-year calculation will be much less than 3 years when it's finally done. And the US has got to appreciate that leverage is relative, not absolute. And this is, I think, a big miscalculation on the US side. Again, you can see there is this very simplistic, when you move from real estate transactions to international trade transactions, these are not the same types of situations, and there is much more complexity in an international trade transaction than in negotiating a price or the terms and conditions of buying a hotel. And it's not obvious to me that the toolkit and the mindset that helps you with buying a hotel or selling a hotel is the right mindset for fixing the world trading system.
That's a very subtle dig at the president. So you said if the markets for Chinese goods stay open, would you recommend European markets to stay open?
What I would recommend is a very evidence-driven assessment about whether Chinese imports are accelerating above previous trends. And I think the concern, and you will read this a lot, there was an article in yesterday's New York Times which managed to make this case without providing much evidence, which was to say, look, there is a fear that Chinese exports, which used to go to the US, are going to be redirected to Europe. If that happens, we should see Chinese imports into Europe in certain products, the rate of it, growth of it, accelerate above the pre-Liberation Day growth rate. So suppose the pre-Liberation Day growth rate was 5%, and then you suddenly see imports surging into Europe in a particular product at 10%. This might be an area of concern, but it might not. Suppose Europe doesn't have a particularly big industry in that sector, or suppose prices in Europe for those goods are very, very high. Governments may turn around and say, well, look, actually, we welcome the increased supplies from abroad. So there's reasons why governments might not want to take action against those deflected products, as they're called. But there could also be reasons why governments do, especially if there's a lot of import competing industry which faces pressure. And so that's the starting point. What we need to do is to sort of figure out how prevalent this is. And in the last piece of work that we made public with Fernando Martin, Fernando and I looked at how many products China exported to the United States before the first trade war, where the Chinese exports exceeded $1 billion. And there were 76 of them. Of those 76 products, these are the products which are the candidates for redirection, because there's enough of them. You have to have a certain amount of these exports, otherwise there's nothing to redirect, or little to redirect. And so of those 76 products, 16 didn't face a tariff increase at all, so you can take them off the table. By the way, in that list included a lot of products that Apple exports to from China to the US. So of the 60 that are left, then what you want to do is to calculate for each of the 60, what was the pre-trade war growth rate of imports, and then compare the growth rate of imports in 2018 and 2019 once the trade war began. And if you do that, then you find out, and you do this across the G20 and Switzerland, so we did for all of the countries and G20 plus Switzerland, you find out that in only 42% of cases did trade deflection happen. And then we went and checked using the global trade alert data, which you mentioned earlier, how many cases did the governments take defensive measures against those import surges, and that only happens half of the time. So what you, on average, so that average varies a lot across countries, and the exposure to trade deflection varies a lot across countries. What's extraordinary is that this fear about trade deflection, it turns out that its incidence of trade defection is patchy.
Okay.
And the response to it is patchy too. And when you put this together, then what you realize is that governments in their own behavior have revealed that they're willing to accept quite a number of import accelerations from China. They haven't acted against all of them. And so that begs the question, what's different this time around? The last thing to say here is that because of the first US trade war, the number of products that China exports to the United States, which are greater than $1 billion in value in 2023, is down to, I think, 64 from 76. So actually the rate, the number of products where trade deflection can happen is actually gone down. Okay? the reason that Fernando and I put this paper out was to try and help policymakers and officials who want to find themselves informed or inform themselves about this to think in a structured, quantitative way about whether or not trade deflection is happening, and then to try and get them to think about whether they really want to take action at all. Because in the past, in many cases, they haven't. Now, how do we relate this to your question? Will the rest of the world's markets remain open to China? Well, that depends on to what extent many policymakers succumb to the New York Times propagated fear, and the fear you read in other leading newspapers, or whether all the fear is also peddled by import competing firms who want the protection, or whether or not the governments are going to step back, use an empirical and evidence-driven process to identify where the problems are. And it should be clear from the way that I'm talking that I believe that a more evidence-driven surgical process would be desirable. And then to the extent that it's surgical, then there will be space for China to be able to redirect some of its exports to abroad and to countries which want to buy them.
Yeah.
Okay. And so that's it. And I think what the important thing here is that there may be some of your listeners who sit there and think, well, we shouldn't buy more from China. But I can assure you that there are plenty of listeners out there who are okay about buying stuff from China, even if they don't say it. That's what they do. And so I think we should not jump to policy conclusions here just because we fear that China might export more.
So evidence-based surgical interventions. Thankfully, you provide a lot of evidence and work that helps us go beyond fear that is induced by a lot of the headlines, as you mentioned. So it's pretty evident where our listeners should go next to get a better idea of the situation at large, namely to the Global Trade Alert and the many, and I have to say, as someone who reads it frequently, excellent briefings and data provided that is accessible even for people like me who did not necessarily excel in economics class. So that's, I think, definitely something our listeners should check out. But do you see other sources? Do you have other recommendations of what to read or listen to or watch next to better make sense of the current situation and not get wrapped up in fear?
Yes, so I think let me share a few recommendations with colleagues. I'd also add just to say that you might also your listeners might also look at the postings that my colleagues and I from the St. Gallen Endowment put up on LinkedIn. So Johannes Fritz, Fernando Martin, Tommaso Giardini, Ana Elena Sancho, all of these people are posting quite frequently really interesting material. But we're not alone. So let's just stick with LinkedIn for the moment. There is a professor at Michigan State University called Jason Miller who publishes very frequently empirical takes on contemporary trade dynamics. And I find his postings absolutely excellent. Then in terms of research institutes, I find the work that is done at the Peterson Institute excellent. Here, the combination of the insights of people such as Chad Bown, Mary Lovely, Gary Huffbauer, Adam Posen, and occasionally Morris Obsfeld also writes on trade stuff as well. These are all excellent contributors, and there are other fantastic people at Peterson as well. Now, within Washington, the Washington think tank scene, it's changing a little bit because the situation is becoming a bit more tense. And so I think, again, one has to read carefully between the lines, but I'm very happy to look at from time to time work by CSIS, the Cato Institute, also the Council on Foreign Relations, although they're based in New York. These are also very credible outfits which are following as well.
And they are all on LinkedIn as well, by the way, so that's easy to keep track of what is happening.
Absolutely. And of course, many trade policy professionals migrated from X to LinkedIn in the recent years. And so it is a great place to keep track of things. Then in terms of sort of podcasts, because trade policies become so salient, any number of the sort of really high quality podcasts are worth listening to. So I really liked Ezra Klein's interview with Peter Orszag recently. And of course, in addition to this, we have a number of Financial Times writers, which are excellent. So Alan Beattie comes immediately to mind. Then, the Wall Street Journal has fantastic coverage of trade issues. The New York Times, I was a little bit critical earlier, but I think, on net, I mean, they are clearly professional people doing an excellent job. And so there's good media material out there. I suppose our friends of The Economist would be upset if I didn't mention their coverage. What The Economist has, because it's a weekly publication, I think the journalists there have a bit more time to run the numbers. And so I particularly enjoy looking at their charts as well as reading the examples they give. So there's quite a lot of material out there to be absorbed over time. So these are different ways of staying on top of all of this material.
And gives us a good reason to stay on LinkedIn, even though there's a lot of fluff on there as well. So thank you for all the great tips, Simon. And thank you so much for taking time in what must be an extremely busy season for you. So I greatly appreciate coming back to St. Gallen, albeit virtually for this podcast. Thank you so much. And I hope to have you on at another time, maybe again, if you're willing.
Certainly. Look, it was fantastic, Claudia, to talk to you again. And to think that we first met over 20 years ago when I was a new professor and you were still doing your master's degree, I believe.
Yeah, I was.
So time flies by and we all move on. And you've moved on to much, much bigger things. So congratulations. And congratulations on this podcast as well.
Thank you. That's so sweet of you. And thank you to everyone who has been listening. Looking forward to have you back for our next episode of Grüezi Amerika. And with that, auf Wiederhören.
Grüezi Amerika. Views from the Sister Republic. A University of St. Gallen podcast by Claudia Brühwiler.